Since its founding in 1923, Disney Studios has produced many well-known films, as well as an array of characters, such as Mickey Mouse in the late 1920s and Simba from The Lion King in 1994. Another group of well-known characters produced by Disney are the Disney princesses. Throughout the early 1900s, female characters produced by the animation industry fomented stereotypes regarding their appearance and actions, which led to an overall view of women being seen as weak, incapable, and in need of a man's help. Disney Studios began the same way, with stereotypical characters, until the studio broke this barrier in its Renaissance period in the 90s, when producers wanted to create innovative and more contemporary princess movies. By doing so, Disney altered the views of what a princess is in the eyes of young children, and, since then, has progressed in creating accurate and diverse female roles in their movies for kids to look up to. In many animation studios, there were common stereotypes that were incorporated into female character design. They were often portrayed as weaker than the male characters, and when they were not off being rescued, they were often objectified by other characters. These women did not serve as exemplary role models for the children of that time, especially young girls. Disney Studios had a similar beginning in 1923 as the other animation studios of its time. Many of the female characters were not mindful of common gender stereotypes that prevailed throughout works of animation during the 1900s. Women were making a strive towards equality through the first wave of feminism that began in 1848 and ended in 1919. It granted women the right to vote within the 19th Amendment. However, they were still seen as lesser than men. Thus, Disney's first 3 princess movies reflected a culture in which women still lacked the social equality and sexual autonomy that would come years later. From 1937 to the 1950s, Disney's classical era introduced some of the more traditional princesses. In 1937, Disney released its first full-length animated feature, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Princess Snow White's greatest strength was her beauty, and her behavior often incorporated many gender stereotypes. For instance, after facing a life-threatening danger and finding a cottage in the woods and caring for the dwarves inside. Later in the 1950s, both Cinderella and Aurora were portrayed as incapable and constantly in need of help. Throughout their movies, these princesses would sing their way out of misery and obtain their happily ever after by marrying a prince who often recognized them solely for their beauty. From 1940 to 1989, Disney Studios faced a drought of profiting movies. Due to the death of Walt Disney in 1966, the company was losing direction and was no longer the dominant force in animation. In 1984, Jeffrey Katzenberg started working in animation at Disney Studios. Under Katzenberg's direction, Disney turned to directors Ron Clements and John Musker to update The Little Mermaid for a new generation. Disney revitalized the animation division, which led to a huge success of movies, such as The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, and The Lion King. After author Betty Friedan published a book titled The Feminine Mystique, a second wave of feminism was set off in 1963 that lasted until the late 1980s. This radically altered society's treatment of women. It focused on women's legal and social equality and called for the end of sexism and misogyny. By the late 1990s, a third wave of feminism, which dealt specifically with feminine sexuality, had arisen in response to failures of the second wave. This wave focused on a woman's orientation, body, and the destruction of the patriarchal society. The Little Mermaid told the story of an adventurous girl living under the sea who wanted to follow her dream of living on land. Though she marries a prince in the end, she acted to achieve her goals. In an interview with director Ron Clements, he said, I've always identified with Ariel. I know she's taken some heat about giving up her fins just to get a guy, but I never saw it as that. To me, she was just like anybody dreaming about being part of a world vastly different from her own, no matter how impossible it seemed. The Little Mermaid soon became a box office hit and marked the beginning of Disney's Renaissance era. During the early 90s, Disney Studios released 3 new princess films. In the 1991 movie Beauty and the Beast, Belle was constantly criticized by the townspeople for her love of reading, because it was uncommon, especially for a girl, in her society. Emma Watson, a feminist, explained in an interview why she turned down the role of Cinderella in order to play the role of Belle instead. She said, "In a strange way, she challenges the status quo of the place she lives in, and I found that really inspiring. She manages to keep her integrity and have a completely independent point of view." Disney Studios did not stop there. In the mid-1990s, they attempted to introduce cultural diversity among their princesses with Jasmine and Pocahontas in hopes of reaching out to a greater audience. In an interview with Naomi Scott, an actress who played Jasmine in the 2019 remake of Aladdin, says, "She was my favorite Disney princess and she made me feel empowered. She spoke up. She wanted to fight for the choice to marry." Disney's 1998 film Mulan completely shattered the barrier of gender stereotypes and expectations surrounding princesses. Though Mulan wants to keep her family honor, she has no interest in getting dolled up for arranged marriages. She stood her ground and had faith in herself when others did not, saving all of China in the process. In an email interview after the movie's release, one of the directors stated, "The story was ahead of its time in many ways. It seemed to resonate more today than when we made it in 1998, in light of female empowerment. Mulan is the original strong female hero." Renaissance means revival, and there is no better word to describe this era in Disney history. This was not only a revival for the animation studio itself, but also for the characters they were creating. The female characters created changed throughout the Renaissance era in terms of personality, diversity, and character development. The notion of a damsel in distress was beginning to fade away. Young girls could look up to these princesses and view themselves as strong, independent women who fought for what they believed in. Due to conflict with Jeffrey Katzenberg and Michael Eisner, they both retired, leaving the position to Bob Iger, who redefined Disney Studios. He not only introduced some of the well-known films of the revival era, but he even pointed out that the princesses stand up for their beliefs, and their story does not heavily revolve around their love for a man. With changing times and the impact of social media, the fourth wave of feminism emerged in 2012 and has addressed issues regarding body image and workplace discrimination. Women are done with the labels society gives them about how they should look and act. This wave has helped empower women and further break the barrier of sexual discrimination. With each Disney film, diversity and opportunity have advanced. The princesses following Disney's Renaissance period have continued to chip away at the barrier of stereotypes generated by earlier animated characters. For instance, Merida from the 2012 film Brave openly rejected being married off. An even bigger step forward is 2016's Princess Moana, who has a more proportional and accurate body type, as well as no love interest throughout the film. She saved her island and took her father's place as leader of her people. Disney Studios has evolved greatly regarding the depiction of female characters, specifically the princesses. From 1937 to the late 1950s, the Disney princesses were always carried off by a man, but that all quickly changed around 1989 with the next generation of princesses who fought for their freedom as women and defied the need of a man in their lives. Both the character development and the diversity began to alter the views and requirements of the makings of a princess. Since then, Disney princesses have continued to morph into independent, strong women who truly prove they can be fearless heroes. From Snow White to Moana, characteristics of these Disney female personalities have always reflected the time period during which they were created. Because society is constantly changing, future princesses will continue to help alter society's views for the better, as well as prove to young children that they can do the same.